The Rise of Joseph Stalin, from Gori to the Kremlin. Reciprocal wind cuts across Red Square on March 5, 1953, carrying with it the weight of an epoch about to end. Inside the Kremlin walls, in a dacha at Kuntsevo, a man lies dying. For nearly 3 decades, his name has been spoken in whispers, in prayers, and in terror. Joseph Stalin, the man of steel, who transformed a backward agrarian empire into an industrial superpower, who helped defeat Nazi Germany, and who oversaw the deaths of millions of his own people, draws his final breaths. The cerebral hemorrhage that struck him 4 days ago has done what no enemy could accomplish. As his inner circle watches, waiting to see who will inherit his terrible throne, the question hangs in the frozen Moscow air. Who was this man who held more absolute power than perhaps any figure in human history? To understand Joseph Stalin is to confront one of the great paradoxes of the 20th century. He was a dictator who industrialized a nation, a tyrant who defeated fascism, a leader who brought his country from wooden plows to nuclear weapons, and a man whose policies caused the deaths of millions through famine, execution, and forced labor. His story is not one of simple heroism or pure villainy, but something far more complex and disturbing. It is the story of how one man's vision of modernization became inseparable from one of history's greatest human catastrophes. Gori, the making of a revolutionary. December 18, 1878. In the small Georgian town of Gori, nestled in the shadow of ancient fortresses and surrounded by mountains, a boy is born into poverty and violence. His name is Joseph Bessarionis Jugashvili, though the world will come to know him by another name. Gori, part of the vast Russian Empire, is a place where Georgian culture struggles to maintain its identity against Russian domination. The boy's mother, Ekaterine Geladze, a washerwoman and domestic servant, is deeply religious and dreams her only surviving son will become a priest. Her 2 other children died in infancy, leaving Joseph as her sole focus, her hope for escape from grinding poverty. His father, Vissarion Jugashvili, is a cobbler whose small business has failed. Vissarion is a violent alcoholic who beats his wife and son with savage regularity. When Joseph is 5 years old, his father abandons the family to work in a factory in Tiflis, the capital of Georgia. The scars from these beatings, both physical and psychological, will never fully heal. But there are other scars as well. At age 7, Joseph contracts smallpox, a disease that ravages his face and leaves it pockmarked for life. Other children call him Pocky, and the cruelty of their taunts feeds a growing reservoir of resentment. Not long after, a carriage accident severely injures his left arm, leaving it permanently weakened and shorter than his right. Despite these hardships, or perhaps because of them, young Joseph excels academically. His mother, working tirelessly to support them, ensures he attends the Gori church school. He learns Russian, though he will always speak it with a thick Georgian accent. He discovers a love of reading, devouring Georgian literature and adventure novels. He climbs in the wild, mountainous countryside around Gori, developing physical toughness despite his small stature and damaged arm. Those who remember him from these years describe a boy of contradictions, intelligent and passionate, but also quick-tempered and vengeful. In 1894, at age 15, Joseph wins a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, one of the most prestigious religious schools in the Caucasus. His mother is overjoyed, believing her dream of seeing her son become a priest will finally be realized. But the seminary, with its strict discipline and oppressive atmosphere, becomes a crucible of rebellion rather than religious devotion. The Orthodox Church-run institution is an instrument of Russification, banning the Georgian language and suppressing Georgian culture. For the young Georgian nationalist, this is intolerable. Inside the stone walls of the seminary, Joseph discovers forbidden literature. He reads Karl Marx, discovering in dialectical materialism an explanation for the poverty and oppression he has witnessed. He joins a secret socialist society called Mesame Dasi, the Third Group, which combines Georgian nationalism with Marxist ideology, begins to see the world through the lens of class struggle, viewing the Russian Empire not as a divine order, but as a system of exploitation that must be overthrown. The priests who run the seminary institute rigid surveillance, spying on students and conducting regular searches of their rooms. This atmosphere of suspicion and control, ironically, becomes his education in the mechanics of authoritarian power. In 1899, Joseph is expelled from the seminary. The official reason given is absence from exams, though some records suggest it was for revolutionary activities. His mother is devastated, but for Joseph, the path is now clear. He will not serve God, he will serve the revolution. He takes on the name Koba, after a legendary Georgian outlaw from a novel by Alexander Kazbegi, a figure who embodied ruthless defiance and personal vengeance. The choice is revealing. From the beginning, his revolutionary identity is tied to violence and retribution. The revolutionary, bank robber for Lenin. The turn of the century finds Koba working briefly, and his true work is underground. He joins the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party and quickly becomes involved in organizing labor strikes and spreading Marxist propaganda. In 1901, the Tsarist secret police, the Okhrana, begin to pursue him. He goes fully underground, beginning a pattern that will define the next 16 years of his life. Arrest, exile to Siberia, escape, return to revolutionary activity, and arrest again. This cycle repeats 7 times. In 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party splits into 2 factions. The Mensheviks favor a gradual, more democratic approach to revolution. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, advocate for a tightly controlled vanguard party and the immediate seizure of power through violence if necessary. Koba chooses the Bolsheviks. Lenin's vision of an iron-disciplined revolutionary elite appeals to something deep in his nature. Here is a philosophy that validates his own instincts for control, his distrust of democracy, his belief that the ends justify the means. Hydrogen revolutions require funding, and the Bolsheviks are desperately short of money. Koba proves himself invaluable as an organizer of what the party euphemistically calls expropriations, but what are actually bank robberies and kidnappings. His most infamous operation takes place on June 26, 1907, in Tiflis. Koba helps plan the robbery of a convoy carrying 250,000 rubles to the state bank. His group attacks in broad daylight with bombs and revolvers. The explosion kills 40 people and maims many others. The money makes its way to Lenin in exile, cementing Koba's reputation as one of the Bolsheviks' most ruthless operatives. During these years, he adopts various pseudonyms for secret party correspondence. Around 1912, he settles on the name that will define history: Stalin, derived from the Russian word for steel. The choice is deliberate. He wants to project an image of hardness, of a man forged in fire, unbreakable and merciless. Joseph Jugashvili is dead. Stalin is born. Lenin recognizes Stalin's usefulness. Unlike many Bolshevik intellectuals who spend their time in theoretical debates in European cafes, Stalin is a practical man of action. He gets things done. In 1912, Lenin appoints him to the Bolshevik Central Committee and makes him editor of Pravda, the party newspaper. Around this time, Stalin also writes Marxism and the National Question, a pamphlet that argues for class identity over ethnic concerns. The essay impresses Lenin, who sees in Stalin a theorist who can apply Marxist doctrine to the complex national questions plaguing the Russian Empire. But in February 1913, the Okhrana finally succeeds in excising Stalin to a remote region of Siberia, far beyond the Arctic Circle. For 4 years, he is trapped in this frozen wasteland, cut off from the revolution he has devoted his life to, preparing. While more prominent Bolsheviks continue their work from European exile, Stalin chops wood, hunts, and waits. The isolation is brutal, but it teaches him patience. It also allows him to avoid the complex theoretical disputes and personal feuds that plague the Bolshevik leadership during these years. When the revolution finally comes in 1917, Stalin will return as an outsider to these conflicts, unencumbered by old alliances or debts. October 1917. The Bolsheviks seize power. In February 1917, the Russian Empire collapses. Tsar Nicholas II, his government paralyzed by military defeats and economic chaos, abdicates. A provisional government takes power, led by moderate liberals and socialists. When news reaches Siberia, Stalin immediately returns to Petrograd, arriving on March 25th. He resumes his position at Pravda and initially advocates cooperation with the provisional government, a position that puts him at odds with many more radical Bolsheviks. Blinked, everything changes when Lenin returns from exile in April 1917. Lenin's April theses call for the immediate overthrow of the provisional government and the establishment of Soviet power. Stalin quickly aligns himself with Lenin's position, demonstrating a flexibility that serves him well. While Leon Trotsky orchestrates the brilliant military operation that seizes power on November 7, 1917, Stalin works behind the scenes, managing communications and consolidating party control. Paying the October Revolution succeeds, but Russia immediately plunges into civil war. The Bolsheviks, now renamed Communists, face enemies on all sides. White Russian armies loyal to the old order, foreign interventionist forces, and internal rebellions. Stalin proves himself effective as a political commissar on various fronts. He is ruthless, pragmatic, and uninterested in military glory for its own sake. What matters to him is that the Bolsheviks win, and he is willing to do whatever is necessary to ensure that outcome. In the chaos of the Civil War and the early Soviet years, Stalin also begins building his power base within the party bureaucracy. Lenin appoints him Commissar for Nationalities, dealing with the complex question of how to organize the dozens of ethnic groups within the former Russian Empire. More importantly, in 1922, Stalin is appointed General Secretary of the Communist Party's Central Committee. Many see this as an administrative post, a role for managing paperwork and meetings. Stalin understands it is the key to everything. Control of the party apparatus means control of appointments, control of information, control of access to Lenin. While brilliant theorists like Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Bukharin debate philosophy, Stalin quietly places his supporters in key positions throughout the party structure. Lenin's testament, the warning ignored. By late 1922, Lenin's health is failing. A series of strokes leaves him partially paralyzed and increasingly unable to govern. As he lies incapacitated, Lenin watches with growing alarm as Stalin accumulates power. Stalin's behavior toward Lenin's wife, Nadezhda Krupskaya, is particularly troubling. He is rude and dismissive, treating her with contempt. When Lenin learns of this, something crystallizes in his mind. Stalin is dangerous. Between December 1922 and January 1923, Lenin dictates what becomes known as his testament. In it, he assesses the major figures in the party leadership. About Stalin, he writes something devastating. Stalin has concentrated enormous power in his hands, but he is too rude, too brutal, too intolerant. Lenin explicitly recommends that Stalin be removed from his position as General Secretary. On January 4, 1923, he adds a postscript, making his position even clearer. Stalin must be removed. Pancakes, but Lenin never makes this document public. On January 21, 1924, he dies of a stroke. The testament becomes a political bomb waiting to explode. Stalin, through his network within the party apparatus, learns of its existence and works to suppress it. At the 13th Party Congress in May 1924, the Central Committee decides not to publish the testament. Stalin's allies, particularly Grigori Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev, defend him, arguing that Stalin has changed his ways and that unity requires keeping him in his position. It is a decision they will not survive to regret. Stalin organizes Lenin's funeral with great ceremony, positioning himself as the devoted disciple and natural heir. He gives a solemn speech at the funeral, swearing to uphold Lenin's legacy. Meanwhile, Trotsky, who many see as Lenin's natural successor, is absent. Stalin had deliberately given him the wrong date for the funeral. It is a small manipulation, but effective. The symbolism is powerful. Stalin stands at Lenin's side, while Trotsky is nowhere to be seen. The struggle for succession. Stalin outmaneuvers his rivals. The 5 years following Lenin's death are a masterclass in political manipulation. Stalin faces formidable opponents: Leon Trotsky, brilliant military leader and theorist; Grigori Zinoviev, head of the Comintern; Lev Kamenev, chairman of the Moscow Soviet; and Nikolai Bukharin, the party's leading intellectual. All are more famous than Stalin, more accomplished orators, more respected by the old Bolshevik guard. Stalin's advantage is his control of the party machinery and his willingness to shift alliances ruthlessly. The battle is fought over policy as well as personality. Trotsky advocates for permanent revolution, arguing that socialism cannot survive in one country and that the Soviet Union must promote communist revolutions worldwide. Stalin counters with socialism in one country, arguing that the Soviet Union must first build its own strength before exporting revolution. This position appeals to nationalist sentiment and to the exhaustion many feel after years of war and chaos. Stalin presents himself as the practical alternative to Trotsky's dangerous adventurism. Staging 10. Defeating the left opposition, 1924-1927. Stalin forms a triumvirate with Zinoviev and Kamenev to isolate Trotsky. At party congresses, they orchestrate attacks on Trotsky's theories and personal loyalty. Trotsky, who is proud and dismissive of mundane organizational work, refuses to stoop to Stalin's level. He does not campaign for support, does not build his own organizational base. By 1925, he is stripped of his position as Commissar for War. By 1927, he is expelled from the party entirely and exiled to Kazakhstan, then forced into foreign exile. Stage 2. Turning on the right, 1927-1929. With Trotsky defeated, Stalin no longer needs Zinoviev and Kamenev. He switches positions, now advocating for rapid industrialization and forced collectivization of agriculture, policies he had previously opposed. He allies with Bukharin and the right opposition to defeat Zinoviev and Kamenev, who suddenly realize the monster they have helped create. They try to form a united opposition with Trotsky, but it is too late. They are expelled from the party in 1927, humiliated and broken. Stage 3. Destroying the right, 1928-1929. Bukharin, who supported Stalin against the left and then against Zinoviev and Kamenev, now faces Stalin alone. As Stalin pushes for increasingly radical economic policies, Bukharin realizes these will lead to catastrophe. He tries to rally support against Stalin, but Stalin now controls the party apparatus completely. 4 out of 9 Politburo members are Stalin loyalists. By November 1929, Bukharin and the other right opposition leaders are expelled from the party leadership. Stalin stands alone atop the Soviet state. The victory is complete, but it is achieved through methods that would define his entire rule: manipulation, betrayal, and the ruthless exploitation of institutional power. Stalin has learned that in Soviet politics, controlling the party machinery is more valuable than brilliance or popularity. He has learned that former allies can become enemies to be destroyed. And he has learned that with enough patience and ruthlessness, any opponent can be defeated. These lessons will shape the horror to come. The first 5-year plan: steel and suffering. On October 1, 1928, Stalin launches the first 5-year plan, declaring it a revolution from above. The Soviet Union, he argues, is 50 to 100 years behind the advanced capitalist countries. If the gap is not closed within 10 years, the Soviet Union will be crushed by its enemies. The plan's goals are staggering: a 111% increase in coal production, 200% in iron, 335% in electrical power. The emphasis is on heavy industry, on the massive construction projects that will transform the Soviet Union from an agricultural nation into an industrial superpower. The city of Magnitogorsk becomes the symbol of this transformation. Founded on the site of iron ore deposits in the Ural Mountains, it grows almost overnight into one of the largest steel-producing complexes in the world. Tens of thousands of workers, many of them peasants with no industrial experience, labor in brutal conditions to build the vast blast furnaces and rolling mills. The work is dangerous, the housing inadequate, the food insufficient. But the propaganda is relentless. Workers are building socialism. They are heroes of labor. They are forging the future. American and European engineers and consultants pour into the Soviet Union, bringing technical expertise the Soviets desperately need. The Soviets purchase entire factories from abroad, importing the technology that will underpin their industrial revolution. It is capitalism financing the construction of its supposed enemy, a historical irony lost in the urgency of the moment. Commentarios and Stakhanovite movement, named after coal miner Alexei Stakhanov, who reportedly mined 102 tons of coal in a single shift in 1935, 14 times his quota, becomes a propaganda tool to push workers beyond human limits. Contests are organized to find the best workers. The winners receive prizes, recognition, better housing. The message is clear. Individual achievement serves the collective, and those who work hardest build socialism fastest. But the reality behind the propaganda is grimmer. The quotas are often impossible. The statistics are frequently falsified, and those who fail to meet targets face harsh consequences. The first five-year plan is declared complete in December 1932, 1 year ahead of schedule. Stalin announces a great victory. Heavy industry has increased dramatically. The Soviet Union has moved from fifth to second in the world in industrialization, trailing only the United States. New factories, new power plants, new transportation networks have been built across the vast Soviet territory. Proportional, but the cost is immense. Consumer goods have been sacrificed for heavy industry. Living standards for ordinary people have declined. The emphasis on production targets over safety leads to frequent industrial accidents. And most catastrophic of all, the aggressive extraction of resources from agriculture to fund industrialization sets the stage for one of the 20th century's greatest human disasters. Collectivization, the war on the peasantry. With industrialization, Stalin launches an equally radical transformation of agriculture. Since 1929, he has pushed for the collectivization of all farmland. Private farms are to be abolished. In their place, collective farms, kolkhozy, will pool peasant land and labor under state control. The stated goal is to modernize agriculture, to bring efficiency and mechanization to a sector still dominated by traditional methods. The real goal is to extract resources from the countryside to fund industrial development and to break the political and economic independence of the peasantry. Phased. The peasants resist. For generations they have worked their own land. The idea of surrendering their farms, their animals, their tools to collective ownership is intolerable. In the countryside, resistance takes many forms. Some peasants slaughter their livestock rather than hand them over to the collectives. Others hide grain, refuse to plant, or sabotage machinery. The scale of resistance shocks the party leadership. By early 1930, armed uprisings break out across the Soviet Union. Breaking scientists is brutal. He launches a campaign against the kulaks, supposedly wealthy peasants who are accused of being class enemies, sabotaging collectivization. In reality, the definition of kulak is elastic and arbitrary. Any peasant who resists, who hides food, who is merely more successful than his neighbors, can be labeled a kulak. Between 1930 and 1932, roughly 1.8 million peasants are deported to remote regions of Siberia and Central Asia. Perhaps 390,000 die during the forced resettlement. Entire villages are emptied at gunpoint. On March 2, 1930, Stalin publishes an article titled "Dizzy with Success," in which he blames local officials for excesses in collectivization and calls for a temporary slowdown. It is a tactical retreat, allowing peasants to leave collectives and de-escalating the immediate crisis. But by autumn 1930, collectivization resumes with renewed intensity. By 1932, nearly all agricultural land in the Soviet Union is collectivized. The Holodomor, death by hunger. Ukraine, the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, suffers most acutely. In 1932, the grain harvest in Ukraine falls below expectations. There is still enough to feed the population, but Stalin sets grain procurement quotas at impossibly high levels. When Ukrainian farmers cannot meet these quotas, Stalin's response is to punish the entire region. On August 7, 1932, he signs the Law of 5 Stalks, which makes stealing even small amounts of grain from collective farms punishable by death or 10 years in the Gulag. The theft of socialist property becomes a capital crime. Pornography. By November 1932, special brigades sweep through Ukrainian villages, confiscating not just the state's share, but every last bit of food. They search houses, barns, even dig up yards looking for hidden grain. They take the seed grain farmers need for the next planting. They take the food families have stored to survive the winter. Anyone caught hiding food is arrested or shot. Villages that fail to meet quotas are blacklisted, surrounded by troops, and blockaded. No one can enter or leave. No food can come in. It is a death sentence by starvation. The winter of 1932-1933 brings unimaginable suffering to Ukraine. As food disappears, people eat grass, acorns, bark, anything that might provide a few calories. Parents watch their children wither. The old and weak die first, then the young, then everyone. Soviet police archives from the period document cases of cannibalism, of families driven mad by hunger, of entire villages falling silent as the last inhabitants die. Bodies lie in the streets of major cities. The living no longer have the strength to bury the dead. Contemporary demographic studies estimate that 3.9 million Ukrainians died in the famine, approximately 13% of Ukraine's population. In some regions, the death rate reached 29%. Across the entire Soviet Union, including Kazakhstan and other grain-producing regions, between 5 and 7 million people perished in the famine of 1932-1933. The Ukrainian famine, known as the Holodomor, meaning death by hunger, is particularly targeted at Ukrainian nationalism as well as peasant resistance. While famine rages, the Soviet Union continues to export grain. Approximately 1.7 million tons are shipped abroad in 1932-1933, enough to have saved millions of lives. Prohibited depression denies the famine is happening. Foreign journalists who report on the catastrophe are accused of fabricating anti-Soviet propaganda. Within the Soviet Union, even mentioning the famine is dangerous. The 1937 census reveals the demographic catastrophe, the population far below projections, but the census is suppressed and the census board arrested. Only decades later, as Soviet archives open, does the full horror become undeniable. Historians continue to debate whether the Holodomor constitutes genocide. Some argue Stalin deliberately used famine as a weapon against Ukrainian nationalism. Others point to the broader famine affecting multiple regions and argue it was the unintended consequence of disastrous agricultural policies combined with deliberate confiscation policies. What is beyond dispute is the staggering death toll, the suffering of millions, and the Soviet regime's active role in creating and worsening the catastrophe. The terror famine of 1932-1933 stands as one of the great crimes of the 20th century. The Great Purge. The party devours itself. December 1, 1934. In Leningrad, Sergei Kirov, the popular party boss and a potential rival to Stalin, is shot dead by Leonid Nikolaev. Within hours, Stalin uses the assassination as justification for a campaign of terror that will consume the Soviet Union for the next 4 years. Whether Stalin ordered Kirov's murder or merely exploited it remains uncertain, but the result is clear. The Great Purge begins. The first targets are the old Bolsheviks, the men who made the revolution with Lenin. In August 1936, the first Moscow trial begins. Zinoviev and Kamenev, Stalin's former allies who helped him defeat Trotsky, now sit in the dock accused of forming a terrorist organization, of plotting to kill Stalin, of conspiring with foreign powers. The charges are absurd, but under torture and psychological pressure, both men confess. On August 24, 1936, they are found guilty and shot. The show trial is carefully staged, broadcast to demonstrate that even the highest party officials are subject to Soviet justice. What it actually demonstrates is that no one, no matter how loyal they once were, is safe. The second trial follows in January 1937. More prominent Bolsheviks are accused of sabotage, wrecking, and collaboration with Trotsky and foreign powers. Most are executed. The third trial, in March 1938, includes Nikolai Bukharin, Lenin's favorite theorist and Stalin's last major rival. Bukharin's performance in court is remarkable. He skillfully parries the prosecutor's questions, demonstrating the absurdity of the charges. But the outcome is predetermined. He is sentenced to death and executed. But the show trials are only the visible surface of a much larger terror. Behind closed doors, the NKVD, the secret police under Nikolai Yezhov, implements mass operations on an industrial scale. Each NKVD office is given arrest quotas. Categories of people are targeted: former members of opposition parties, those with foreign connections, ethnic minorities, priests, intellectuals, anyone who might pose a threat to the regime. Often the secret police simply fabricate cases. People are arrested at night, taken to NKVD prisons, interrogated under torture until they confess to crimes they did not commit, and then shot or sent to the Gulag. In Soviet society, the Communist Party itself is decimated. 1/3 of the party's 3 million members are purged. Of the 102 members of the 1934 Central Committee, 99 are shot. The military suffers catastrophically. Convinced that foreign intelligence services have infiltrated the armed forces, Stalin orders the arrest of thousands of military officers. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, one of the Soviet Union's most capable military leaders, is accused of spying for Germany. He and other senior commanders are tortured until they confess, then executed. In total, 81 of 103 generals and admirals are executed. About 30,000 military officers are purged, removing much of the Red Army's experienced leadership just as war approaches. Greenwich Het extends to ethnic minorities. The Polish operation of the NKVD arrests 150,000 Poles living in the Soviet Union. 111,000 are executed. Similar operations target Germans, Latvians, Finns, Greeks, and other ethnic groups. The logic is simple and paranoid. These people have connections to foreign countries, therefore they are potential spies and must be eliminated. According to official Soviet records, 681,692 people were executed for political crimes between 1937 and 1938. The total number arrested and sent to the Gulag during these years runs into the millions. Historian Robert Conquest estimated total deaths during the Great Terror at around 700,000 to 1.2 million. The true number may never be known, as many deaths were not officially recorded, and the NKVD destroyed evidence of its crimes. The atmosphere in the Soviet Union during these years is one of pervasive fear. No one is safe. Party members denounce each other to prove their loyalty or settle personal scores. Children are encouraged to denounce their parents. Neighbors inform on neighbors. Knock on the door at night means the NKVD has come. Families of those arrested are often sent to the camps as well. Being related to an enemy of the people is itself a crime. The terror feeds on itself, creating an atmosphere of paranoia where trust becomes impossible. In 1938, Stalin replaces Yezhov with Lavrenti Beria as head of the NKVD. Yezhov himself is soon arrested and executed. The worst of the Great Purge ends, but the system of terror remains in place. Stalin has achieved his goal. All potential rivals are dead or in the camps. The party, the military, the government, all bow to his absolute will. But the cost is staggering. The Soviet Union has been gravely weakened, just as the greatest test approaches. Molotov-Ribbentrop, the pact with the devil. Moved August 23, 1939. In Moscow, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop sign a non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany. The world is stunned. The two ideological enemies, supposedly locked in mortal combat, have made peace. But the pact includes a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland, the Baltic states, and parts of Romania are to be carved up between Hitler and Stalin. On September 1, 1939, Germany invades Poland from the west. On September 17, the Soviet Union invades from the east. The Polish army, already devastated by the German blitzkrieg, now faces a two-front war. Within weeks, Poland ceases to exist as an independent state. On September 28, German and Soviet forces meet at Brest-Litovsk for a joint military parade, celebrating their conquest. Stalin uses the pact to expand Soviet territory and prepare for the war he knows is coming. Soviet forces occupy eastern Poland, incorporating it into Ukraine and Belarus. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are annexed in 1940. Bessarabia is taken from Romania. But Stalin's greatest concern is securing the Soviet northwestern frontier against Finland. The Winter War with Finland, from November 1939 to March 1940, is meant to be a brief operation to secure strategic territory near Leningrad. Instead, it becomes a humiliating disaster. The Finnish army, though vastly outnumbered, uses the terrain and winter conditions to devastating effect. Soviet forces suffer catastrophic casualties, at least 126,875 soldiers killed and 264,908 wounded. Stalin forbids any public disclosure of the losses. The war is presented as a Soviet victory, but military observers around the world, including Hitler, note the Red Army's poor performance. It is a dangerous illusion that will have consequences when Germany attacks. Forgiveness with Germany buys Stalin time, but he misreads Hitler's intentions. Despite receiving intelligence reports throughout 1940 and 1941, warning of German military buildup on the Soviet border, despite German troops massing in enormous numbers, Stalin refuses to believe Hitler will attack. He has convinced himself that Germany will not risk a two-front war while still fighting Britain. When Soviet intelligence and even German deserters warn of imminent invasion, Stalin dismisses the reports as provocations designed to drag the Soviet Union into premature war. It is one of the greatest intelligence failures in history. Operation Barbarossa. The Wehrmacht strikes. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. Along a front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, over 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces, pour across the Soviet border. Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history, has begun. The sleeping Red Army is caught completely unprepared. Within hours, much of the Soviet Air Force is destroyed on the ground. Within days, entire Soviet armies are encircled and forced to surrender. Within weeks, German forces advance hundreds of miles into Soviet territory. Stalin's reaction to the invasion is initially one of shock and paralysis. For 2 days, he remains in his dacha, apparently unable to process the disaster. When he finally emerges, it is to take direct control of the war effort. On July 3rd, he addresses the Soviet people by radio, beginning with words that acknowledge the catastrophe. Comrades, citizens, brothers and sisters, men of our army and navy, my friends, I am speaking to you. It is the first time he has used such intimate language, the first time he has admitted that the Soviet Union faces mortal peril. Stalin appoints himself Supreme Commander of the Soviet Armed Forces and Chairman of the State Defense Committee. He takes personal control of military operations, often micromanaging generals from the Kremlin. In the first months of the war, this interference is often disastrous. Stalin refuses to allow retreats even when positions are clearly untenable, leading to massive encirclements and the capture of hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers. Order number 270, issued on August 16, 1941, declares that any soldier who surrenders is a traitor. Soldiers are ordered to fight to the death. Those who are captured are considered to have betrayed the motherland. Their families will be punished. Stalin's own son, Yakov, is captured by the Germans. When the Germans offer to exchange him for a German field marshal, Stalin refuses. "I will not trade a marshal for a lieutenant," he reportedly says. Yakov dies in German captivity. Order number 227, issued in July 1942, becomes infamous. "Not a step back," it commands. Soldiers who retreat without authorization are to be shot. Penal battalions are formed, composed of soldiers accused of cowardice or desertion. These battalions are sent on suicide missions, forced to clear minefields by walking through them, to attack fortified positions without adequate support. The Red Army's casualties are staggering, but slowly the German advance is slowed. Stalingrad, the city that would not fall. By summer 1942, the west of a power of justice at the belothers creases and photo the start that would not fall. By Stalingrad, the city that would not fall, by summer 1942, the west of power of justice that would not fall, by Omfoma. By summer 1942, the west of memories that would not fall. By summer 1942, the west of power of justice that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall, by lived and lift. By summer, the world brings some of them, revealing the any days avail by the Stalingrad. By summer 1942, the west of justice that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall, by 3939. In the world peasant of the Elitov score, the game is framed from the brace of Junton and latest hand, the city that would not fall. By summer 1942, the west of justice that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall, by 3939. My summer 1942, the west of memories that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall, by 3939. By summer, the city that would not fall. By summer 1942, the west of memories that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall, by 3939. By summer 1942, the west of memories that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall, by 3939. In eventual people, this din yourself, it is compact with weld from man life, the future. The compact was not include figured, but it associated interest on the folks only one setter in life. This happens also been created feet influence. This is not persant in the page to enable to anywhere as the heart mean. The heard a feature that was working for being good and faith, but then being good at that wouldn't not fall. And well for this, she would not fall. Actually, this is not fall, but the case of this is not created believe. This is not so confected, with one that this is feared and city. By summer 1942, the west of memories that would not fall, plus it memories that would not fall, by 3939. The will present of the Elitov score, The West of the Compact. The West of memories that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall, by 3939. But know that the memories works in made by it will be figured out with well from anywhere for the feature. The best for the world fair, and the government of well of the foremost, there would not fall. One that the West of memories that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall. It the snowfall of 9 will seem probably the well fall. The Stalingrad, the city that would not fall, complex the end of itself from your region by the journey. Stalingrad, the city that would not fall. By summer 1942, the West of memories that would not fall, plus did memories that would not fall. By for that video, the compact that memories works a bid, and this is very clearly and work. In the clues of 936, but the damn script of this maimed lest between this. Even the military of the game were known before understand this truth anywhere. And lead, they workers placed every hard for the tection that memories that would not church them they will pursed right. Stalingrad, the demonstrative in a nation of living that memories works a bit. Their workers being cleared and previously for the link with correct with the character. It was a level of closer in start and previously. The good and well from it. The best ovation both in a matter that memories works a bit. If you're not included, but lives them from vault in any single, and summon, they will prevent it and any matter, and specially, it is not. If the temp of memories works a bit, the great from figure, there would not fall, but they will street and face. There was nothing and anywhere. If memories works a bit, we'll notice one of the use and anywhere. Of course, Stalingrad it's not fall. This workspace for the city, this with any time that 9 for the years and entreatedly to start. If you live this work, they will truly down to it, but know that would not fall. By 17, the demox to contrade that the planned fell, which been with significance of the start, and the work andally. In the clues of them again, the best ovation concern into this. They still be and flaw, the West have completed that living the against me, no and any. The world peasant of the invasion, this was no like to leave. But know that the workers were not clear but the middle, there was not only another meted. They will interested the blinken that start need, with a link with anywhere that would not fall. If you're not continue to disbrock, and said, it makes it. By Stalingrad. The Stalingrad that would not cleared and anywhere, they will doing that anywhere. If they would be an anywhere, a cart with the work, 1942, the Wehrmacht launches a new offensive aimed at capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The city, bearing Stalin's name, becomes the focal point of a battle that will decide the war. Hitler is obsessed with taking the city. Stalin is equally determined to hold it. What follows is one of the most brutal battles in human history. The fighting in Stalingrad is house to house, room to room, hand to hand. The city is reduced to rubble by German bombing and artillery. Soviet soldiers defend every building, every floor, sometimes every staircase. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad is 24 hours. But they keep fighting. Snipers pick off German soldiers from the ruins. Small groups of Soviet soldiers hold positions against overwhelming odds. The Pavlov's house, a 4-story apartment building, is defended by a small garrison for 2 months against constant German attacks. As the German Sixth Army pushes deeper into the ruined city, Soviet commanders prepare a counter-offensive. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launch Operation Uranus, a massive pincer movement that encircles the German Sixth Army. By November 23, 330,000 German and Romanian soldiers are trapped in Stalingrad. Hitler orders them to fight to the last man, forbidding any breakout attempt. The trapped army suffers through a brutal winter with diminishing supplies and no hope of relief. On February 2nd, 1943, the remnants of the German Sixth Army surrender. Of the 330,000 men encircled, only 91,000 survive to go into Soviet captivity. Few will ever return home. The Battle of Stalingrad is the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The myth of German invincibility is shattered. From this point forward, the Red Army is on the offensive. Kursk and the drive to Berlin. In July 1943, the Germans launch one final major offensive in the east, Operation Citadel, aimed at the Kursk salient. Stalin, warned by Soviet intelligence and spies in the German High Command, prepares a defense in depth. The Battle of Kursk becomes the largest tank battle in history. German forces throw everything they have at the Soviet defenses, but the Red Army holds. When the German offensive stalls, Soviet forces launch their own counteroffensive. The Germans are driven back. From Kursk onward, the Wehrmacht is in retreat. Crowned Red Army advances westward through 1943 and 1944. Stalin's strategy becomes increasingly clear. He wants not just to defeat Germany, but to dominate Eastern Europe after the war. The Red Army liberates territory that will become satellite states: Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia. In each country, Soviet forces install communist governments or support local communists in seizing power. The Warsaw Uprising of August 1944 reveals Stalin's cynicism. As the Red Army approaches Warsaw, the Polish Home Army, loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, rises up against the German occupation. The uprising is timed to coincide with the Soviet advance, expecting Soviet support. Instead, Stalin orders the Red Army to halt on the Vistula River and wait. For 63 days, German forces crush the uprising, while Soviet troops watch from across the river. Stalin has no interest in supporting Polish resistance fighters who might oppose Soviet domination after the war. The Warsaw Uprising is defeated. 200,000 Poles die, and the city is destroyed. In April 1945, the Red Army launches its final offensive against Berlin. Stalin is determined that Soviet forces, not the Western Allies, will capture the German capital. The battle is ferocious. Soviet casualties are immense, but by May 2, 1945, Berlin falls. Hitler kills himself in his bunker. On May 8th, Germany surrenders unconditionally. The Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets call World War II, is over. The cost to the Soviet Union is almost incomprehensible. Approximately 27 million Soviet citizens died during the war, around 14% of the total population. Of these, roughly 8.7 million were military personnel, while the remainder were civilians killed by combat, famine, disease, and Nazi extermination policies. Entire cities were reduced to rubble. The industrial infrastructure built during the 1930s was devastated. The generation born between 1920 and 1923 was virtually wiped out. But the Soviet Union emerged from the war as one of the two global superpowers. The Red Army occupied Eastern Europe. The Soviet Union now controlled a vast empire stretching from East Germany to the Pacific. Stalin's prestige was at its height. He had led the Soviet Union through the darkest moment in its history and emerged victorious. The man who had weakened the Red Army through purges, who had ignored warnings of the German invasion, who had ordered countless soldiers into suicidal attacks, was now hailed as the great war leader who defeated fascism. The Gulag, the empire of camps. Behind the propaganda of socialist construction and wartime heroism existed another reality: the Gulag, a vast system of forced labor camps that became one of the defining institutions of Stalin's Soviet Union. Gulag stands for Glavnoye Upravlenie Lagerai, Main Directorate of Corrective Labor Camps. The name refers both to the administrative body that managed the camps and to the camps themselves. The Gulag began under Lenin, but it expanded dramatically under Stalin. By the 1930s, it had become an integral part of both the Soviet penal system and the Soviet economy. The camps were scattered across the Soviet Union, with particular concentrations in Siberia, the far north, and Central Asia. Regions like Kolyma, Vorkuta, and Magadan became synonymous with suffering and death. Psychologist population grew rapidly with each wave of repression. The collectivization campaign of 1930 to 1932 sent hundreds of thousands of deported kulaks to the camps. The Great Purge of 1936–1938 swelled the camps with political prisoners. During World War II, prisoners of war, deportees from occupied territories, and entire ethnic groups accused of collaboration were sent to the camps. By 1953, at the peak of the Gulag system, approximately 2.6 million prisoners were held in camps and labor colonies. Blankets between 1929 and 1953, approximately 18 million people passed through the Gulag system. The tentative historical consensus, based on Soviet archives opened after 1991, is that between 1.5 and 1.7 million died in the camps. However, these official figures are considered conservative by many historians. The camps released terminally ill prisoners just before death to reduce official mortality statistics. Additionally, many who died shortly after release from malnutrition, disease, or injuries sustained in the camps are not counted in the official totals. Prisoners in the Gulag worked in logging operations, mining, construction projects, and industrial production. They built the White Sea-Baltic Canal, canals, railways, roads, and entire cities. The labor was brutal. Prisoners worked up to 14 hours a day in extreme climates, with inadequate food, clothing, and shelter. In the Arctic camps, winter temperatures could drop to -40 degrees. Prisoners labored in these conditions with minimal clothing and insufficient calories. Frostbite, exhaustion, and starvation were constant threats. The camps were economically important to the Soviet state. Entire industrial complexes were built on the backs of prisoner labor. The construction of the Baikal-Amur mainline railway, the development of gold mines in Kolyma, the logging operations in northern Russia, all relied on forced labor. Prisoners were worked until they could no longer function, then released or allowed to die. The camp administration's goal was to extract maximum labor from each prisoner, with minimal concern for survival. Katorih political prisoners suffered particularly. Common criminals, who often ran the internal hierarchies of camps, brutalized political prisoners. The camp guards were frequently sadistic. Arbitrary violence was common. Prisoners could be shot for minor infractions. Torture and sexual violence were widespread. The psychological trauma of the camps was as devastating as the physical suffering. Commentarios was not only a system of punishment and terror, but also a method of social engineering. Stalin used deportation and forced labor to relocate entire populations, to punish ethnic groups suspected of disloyalty, and to populate remote regions of the Soviet Union with forced labor. The camps became a tool of both political repression and economic development, a horrifying merger of ideological control and exploitation. The post-war years, triumph and paranoia. Peter's Soviet Union after 1945 is exhausted but victorious. Stalin's position is unassailable. His cult of personality reaches new heights. He is portrayed as the genius who defeated fascism, the great leader who guided the Soviet people through their darkest hour. Cities, streets, factories, collective farms bear his name. His image is everywhere, on posters, in films, in literature. School children learn to revere him as a wise father. Writers and artists compete to praise him in ever more extravagant terms. But Stalin's paranoia only deepens with age. The final years of his life are marked by new purges and new terrors. The Leningrad Affair of 1949 results in the execution of prominent party leaders accused of creating an anti-party group. Veterans returning from the war, especially those who were prisoners of war or who served in occupied territories are viewed with suspicion. Many are arrested and sent to the camps, accused of being contaminated by exposure to the West. The most ominous development is the anti-cosmopolitan campaign, which increasingly targets Soviet Jews. In 1948, prominent Jewish intellectuals and members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee are arrested. Many are executed in secret in 1952. Stalin's anti-Semitism, long present but suppressed during the war when Soviet Jews were useful for propaganda purposes, now manifests openly. In January 1953, the Soviet press announces the discovery of the Doctors' Plot. 9 prominent doctors, 6 of them Jewish, are accused of attempting to murder Soviet leaders through improper medical treatment. The alleged victims include Andrei Zhdanov, a party boss who died in 1948, and others. The accusations are transparently fabricated, but the campaign unleashes a wave of anti-Semitic hysteria. It appears Stalin is preparing for a massive purge of Soviet Jews, possibly including mass deportation to Siberia. Only his death prevents this catastrophe from unfolding. The Cold War dominates foreign policy. The Soviet Union consolidates control over Eastern Europe, installing communist governments and suppressing opposition. The Berlin blockade of 1948 to 1949 attempts to force the Western powers out of Berlin, but ultimately fails. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tests its first atomic bomb, breaking the American nuclear monopoly. The Korean War, beginning in 1950, sees Soviet support for North Korea against the United States and its allies. The world settles into a tense bipolar order, with the Soviet Union and United States as rival superpowers locked in an ideological and geopolitical struggle that will last for decades. March 5, 1953. The death of the tyrant. On the night of February 28, 1953, Stalin holds a dinner with his inner circle at his Kuntsevo dacha. Lavrenti Beria, Nikita Khrushchev, Georgy Malenkov, and a few others drink and watch a film. The evening ends around 5 a.m. on March 1st. Stalin is in good spirits. The guests leave, and Stalin retires to his private quarters. The next day passes in unusual silence. Stalin's staff, accustomed to his demands and summons, hear nothing from his room. They are afraid to check on him. Stalin has made it clear that anyone who disturbs him without permission will face severe consequences. The guards, the staff, everyone waits in nervous silence. Finally, late on March 1st, a guard ventures to look through a window. He sees Stalin lying on the floor. When help finally arrives, Stalin is found conscious but unable to move or speak. He has suffered a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Whether he could have been saved if medical help had arrived immediately is unknown. But precious hours were lost because everyone was too terrified to check on him. Doctors are summoned, but Stalin's condition is hopeless. The stroke has devastated his brain. For 4 days, he lies semi-conscious in his dacha, while his inner circle watches and waits. They know that when Stalin dies, a struggle for succession will begin. They are already maneuvering for position. March 5, 1953, at 9:50 p.m., Joseph Stalin dies. He is 74 years old. His death is announced the next day. The official cause is cerebral hemorrhage resulting from hypertension. Some historians have speculated about possible foul play, suggesting Stalin may have been poisoned or that medical treatment was deliberately withheld, but no conclusive evidence has emerged. The funeral on March 9, 1953, is a massive state event. Hundreds of thousands of people flood Moscow to view Stalin's body lying in state at the Hall of Columns. The crush of crowds is so severe that at least 109 people are killed in stampedes. Stalin's body is embalmed and placed in the Lenin Mausoleum alongside Lenin. It will remain there until 1961, when Nikita Khrushchev, now in power, orders its removal during the process of de-Stalinization. The outpouring of grief across the Soviet Union is genuine for many. For millions of Soviet citizens, Stalin is the only leader they have known as adults. He led them through the war. He made the Soviet Union a superpower. His death creates genuine anxiety and uncertainty. But for millions of others, including prisoners in the Gulag, Stalin's death brings hope. Maybe now things will change. Maybe now the terror will end. The Reckoning. Stalin's complex legacy. Do we assess Joseph Stalin? He is one of the most significant and most controversial figures of the 20th century. His impact on the Soviet Union, on Europe, on the course of world history is undeniable. But that impact is profoundly ambiguous, impossible to summarize in simple terms of hero or villain. On one side of the ledger stands genuine achievement. Stalin transformed the Soviet Union from a predominantly agricultural society into an industrialized superpower in less than 2 decades. The 5-year plans, whatever their human cost, did create a massive industrial infrastructure. Soviet steel production, electricity generation, and manufacturing capacity grew exponentially. This industrialization, built in the 1930s, provided the material basis for the Soviet Union's ability to defeat Nazi Germany. Without that industrial capacity, the Soviet Union likely would have been defeated. Stalin's leadership during World War II, for all its flaws and costly mistakes, ultimately brought victory. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of the war against Nazi Germany. Roughly 80% of German military casualties occurred on the Eastern Front. The Red Army destroyed the Wehrmacht, captured Berlin, and ended Hitler's regime. Stalin's role in this victory, particularly after he learned to trust his generals and became more flexible in military decision-making, was significant. After the war, the Soviet Union emerged as one of 2 global superpowers. Soviet influence extended across Eastern Europe and beyond. The Soviet Union became a nuclear power, a space power, a military force capable of projecting power globally. For many in the developing world, the Soviet model seemed to offer an alternative path to modernization, a way to achieve rapid industrial development without capitalism. The Soviet Union supported anti-colonial movements and provided an ideological and material alternative to Western dominance. Psychologist is inseparable from immense human suffering. The rapid industrialization was built on forced labor, inadequate living conditions, and suppression of dissent. The collectivization of agriculture caused famines that killed millions. The Holodomor in Ukraine alone took 3.9 million lives and was in significant part the result of deliberate policy choices. The total death toll from collectivization-related famines across the Soviet Union may have reached 5.5 to 6.5 million. The Great Purge of 1936-1938 executed approximately 700,000 to 1.2 million people for political crimes. It decimated the Communist Party, destroyed the military leadership, and created an atmosphere of pervasive terror that traumatized an entire society. The Gulag system imprisoned approximately 18 million people over Stalin's rule, with 1.5 to 1.7 million dying in the camps, according to conservative estimates. The total excess mortality attributable to Stalin's policies varies by historian and methodology, but estimates range from around 9 million to 20 million or more. The Soviet archives, opened after 1991, provide official records of 799,455 executions from 1921 to 1953, around 1.5 to 1.7 million Gulag deaths, 390,000 deaths from dekulakization deportations, and up to 400,000 deaths of deported ethnic groups in the 1940s. To this must be added the millions who died in the famines, the unrecorded deaths, and the demographic losses. These numbers represent not just statistics, but individual human lives. Fathers who never returned from the camps, mothers who starved watching their children die, intellectuals executed in the cellars of the NKVD, soldiers shot by their own side for retreating, entire families deported to Siberia, ethnic groups forcibly relocated. children who grew up never knowing their parents were innocent of the crimes for which they were imprisoned. Confiscated Stalin's legacy in Russia and former Soviet states remains deeply contested. For some, particularly older Russians who lived through the Soviet period, Stalin remains a figure of nostalgia, associated with victory in the war, with stability, with the time when the Soviet Union was a superpower. Polls in Russia consistently show significant percentages viewing Stalin favorably. For others, particularly in Ukraine and other former Soviet republics that suffered most under his rule, Stalin is a tyrant and mass murderer whose crimes must be remembered and condemned. The key to understanding Stalin lies in recognizing that both narratives contain truth, and that the truth is more troubling than either narrative alone suggests. Stalin was not a comic book villain, reveling in suffering for its own sake. He believed, in his own way, in building socialism, in modernizing the Soviet Union, in defeating its enemies. But he was willing to accept any human cost to achieve those goals. He saw people as raw material for historical forces, as resources to be exploited or obstacles to be eliminated. His paranoia, his cruelty, his lack of empathy became instruments of state policy. The industrialization and military victory do not excuse or balance the deaths of millions. The suffering of those who died in the camps, in the famines, before the firing squads, cannot be justified by economic growth statistics or military victories. But neither can we understand the 20th century without recognizing Stalin's role in shaping it, for better and catastrophically for worse. Joseph Stalin's life demonstrates how personal pathology can merge with political power to create industrial-scale tragedy. His childhood traumas, his resentments, his paranoia, normally the stuff of individual psychology, became the driving forces of state policy affecting hundreds of millions of people. His story is a warning about the dangers of concentrated power, about the human cost of utopian ideologies implemented without regard for human life, and about how easily political systems can become machines for destroying their own people. As the snow fell on Moscow on that March day in 1953, as Stalin's body was prepared for display, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The terror of his rule would gradually diminish under his successors. The Gulag population would be released. The most extreme forms of political repression would ease. But the system Stalin built would endure for nearly 4 more decades, until the Soviet Union itself collapsed in 1991. Today, more than 70 years after Stalin's death, his legacy remains a ghost, haunting Russian politics and memory. Statues of Stalin have been re-erected in some Russian cities. Some Russian leaders invoke his memory as a symbol of strength and national greatness. But in Ukraine and many other former Soviet republics, his memory is reviled, his policies recognized as genocide, his name synonymous with oppression. The man of steel, the Georgian peasant who became absolute ruler of a vast empire, the revolutionary who helped build and then terrorized the state he created, remains one of history's most significant and most terrible figures. His story compels us to ask fundamental questions about power, about the relationship between ends and means, about the human capacity for both achievement and atrocity. Joseph Stalin transformed a nation and left a trail of millions dead. Both truths must be faced, neither can be forgotten. That is his legacy, and that is our task in remembering him, to see both the transformation and the tragedy, to understand how they are inseparable, and to ensure that such a concentration of power, such disregard for human life, such willingness to sacrifice millions for abstract goals, never again becomes the organizing principle of a state.